paylaşıyor panel serimizin 3. paneline hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Avrupa Birliği desteğiyle yürüttüğümüz bu
panel,
panel
which is being
serisinde
supported by the European Union. Our objective is to bring together from Turkey and from outside civil society professionals, academics, specialists, and human rights defenders, as well as you, our participants, to discuss relevant subjects in civil society. And on our website, as a foundation and our socials, we have actually shared our themes and also our guests. And we will have upcoming events in the future as well. Once again, we are delighted to be with you. Please feel free to also follow us on social media and follow our also our online events. When we talk about social benefit, what are the things that come to your mind? Let us start off with that question. Thank you so much, everyone. Please share your answers with us. When we talk about social benefit, what are the concepts that come to your mind? In the previous panel, we talked about the duties and responsibilities of the civil society, and today we will be talking about reconceptualizing civil society, and this is the third panel that we're holding as part of this series. We have guests from KİGA, Emrah Gürsel, academic Ferhat Kentel, from Kaos GL, Yıldız Tar, and from Educational Reform we have Işık Tüzün. And Istanbul Policy Center, Urbanization and Local Authorities Coordinator Ayşe Köse Badur will be chairing this session. Hello, Ayşe Köse. You have the floor now. And I wish you all a pleasurable discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to welcome you all to this online event organized by the Hrant Dink Foundation. Thank you so much for being with us here today, and welcome once again. This evening, we will be talking about reconceptualizing civil society and social benefit as a concept. We will be tackling these issues, and our guests actually are people who represent civil society in its many facets. We have academics, and we also have specialists and civil society representatives who have been working on the ground for quite some time. Let us begin with Mr. Kentel. He taught at Istanbul Bilgi University and Şehir University for a very long time, and he's been researching social movements, Islamic movements, and ethnic communities. And he is someone that we all learn from, and he still continues to contribute to this field. And from Education Reform Initiative, Işık Tüzün is also joining us since 2019. She's been the director of this organization. She focuses on freedom of conscience, children's rights, as well as women's rights. Welcome once again. We also have Yıldız Tar joining us from Kaos GL, and they are the media coordinator of Kaos GL, and they are also a journalist, an LGBT activist who has been quite vocal for quite some time. And we also have a guest from Germany, KLGA, Emrah Gürsel, and Emrah has worked on memory, human rights, and youth issues in Turkey for long years, and then he moved to Germany. Now he is the international partnerships director of his organization, and he focuses on anti-Semitism as well as hate speech in his new role. Now, today we will be talking about relevant and pertinent issues when it comes to civil society. And when we look at the domain of civil society, what it corresponds to is a question that we might want to entertain. Very simply put, we can say that between outside family, the state, and market, we have manifestations of civil society. And starting with 1980s, this domain gained a corporate identity and has been rubbing shoulders with many different actors, and on the political domain as well, has become a very important actor, just like the markets or the state. And on the other hand, since the 80s, all across the globe, obviously, political, economic, and social changes have been unabated, and the fact that the civil society has gained so much strength has been a welcome move, but also many injustices sadly continued unabated, and sadly we are living in a world of polarization and vulnerabilities, especially what we're going to discuss this evening will be a reflection of these developments. Let us begin with Mr. Ferhat Kentel, shall we? At the end of the 20th century, when the civil society was burgeoning legally and from a corporate point of view, we see an upsurge. But of course, this existence or this upsurge, does it really translate into our day-to-day lives? Because there are many hurdles that civil society is faced with. But let us hear from you about how civil society came into existence and what sort of an adventure it went through throughout the years. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation. And I believe that this is quite timely, quite an important meeting. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Hrant Dink Foundation for bringing us together. When we try to define civil society, things are rather difficult. We're talking about, content that changes based on the times and based on social movements. But just like you said, very roughly put, outside the state, family, and the markets, you have the civil society that brings together people who fight for certain things, people trying to reclaim their rights, try to earn their rights, make it institutionalized, build a tradition, build a corporate identity. So in a way, civil society is a realm that sort of reshapes the state or creates the foundation of the state. Civil society is creative, and the state actually originates from the civil society as well. So in a way, civil society curbs the state or tames the state. And depending on the strength that actors in the civil society wield, they have the capacity to limit the state or powers that be in a society. But that's not where it all ends. We say non-state actors, but when you rub shoulders with the state so much as civil society, you infiltrate the state, quote unquote, and shape the state and shape the judicial system as well. So in a way, the judiciary is something that gives the state its color, gives it its constitution, and so on and so forth. So this has been a long-standing battle, people reclaiming their rights, reclaiming their identities, and we're talking about a judicial system that actually originated after the struggle of the civil society. And one thing that we might entertain in our heads is this: in order to better understand the realm that we're in, public sphere is a useful concept. At one time, I remember, chronologically, here's how we should explain it. Just like you said, in the 80s, this concept became popularized. Why, you might ask? Because at the time, liberal policies or neoliberal policies were gaining pace. Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the US, Özal in Turkey. There was sort of like an explosion. Kürşad Bumin wrote a book about this in the 80s, and they were awarded a prize, if I'm not mistaken. So people were discussing civil society left and right. Why? Because up until that point, we were living in a different society. Our conceptualization of modernity was different. It was all about the classes. We were talking about capitalism. We were talking about the working class and their struggle against the bourgeoisie and trade unions. So on the one hand, you had class-based policies, and on the other hand, capitalists or bourgeois organizations were also defending their rights. So left and right were clearly delineated, and in Turkey as well. Of course, in the US, in the UK, there are different examples. But when we look at the Turkish left-wing policies were beset by the 1980 coup. And after that, maybe this is a bit of a shortcut, but people were no longer able to talk about class, and civil society was something that they took to heart because they couldn't talk about class politics. So one single actor, not just one single actor, but people realized that collective action was key. So the domain for struggle expanded, and that's how civil society expanded. And civil society infiltrated the private sphere as well as the public sphere. So it really did expand upon itself, and the need that we feel for others became apparent. And this is what I sort of attach great importance to when we talk about civil society. And we could get to that later on. But people realized that individual actors on their own were not strong enough, and there was need for striking alliances and bearing in mind other people coming from other walks of life and so on and so forth. So perhaps in terms of definition, is what I could say when we talk about politics, social relations, democracy. Maybe all of these concepts could be put together side by side. But here's the formula that I have in my head. Alain Touraine, my PhD instructor that I learned a lot from, talks about a tripod. So here's what the tripod is all about. In a society, you have movement, you have impetus. Certain people, young people, women, LGBT people, the Kurds, the Roma, Armenians, immigrants in France, and so on and so forth. Palestinians in Israel. So you have all these intrinsic movements in societies, and without these movements, you cannot talk about a society, or the society would be very authoritarian. So for a society to live properly, to be a true society, you need social movements. But these social movements is not all about taking out to the streets and chanting, and this is what brings democracy into the picture. That's why things that originate from civil society should be manifested within the realm of democracy, and certain rules should be adhered to. Rather than uncontrollable social explosions, we need an institutionalized democracy that has a set of values and rules. In the absence of democracy, you can't really have influential social movements if every time you take to the streets, if you are bashed by the police, if you are not free in the streets, then social movements will become much more violent, much more anarchic, and will be at the fringes of the system. So there's another concept. On top of all of these, social thought or sociological thought, social sciences are all very important. So a society has got to think about these movements and contemplate what's going on. Otherwise, people will be happy or dissatisfied with what's going on in the world. But we would not be able to make sense of what these social movements mean, and there needs to be this trilateral relationship. So as far as I'm concerned, civil society can be summarized with this tripartite model. But by and large, social movements and democracy, what brings them together in terms of generation of knowledge, social sciences, sociology, all are a part of the picture. And over time, going back to your question, we're talking about a flimsy ground and things are changing. And at first, we were talking about the national framework, Denmark, Afghanistan, and whatnot. Turkey, France, and so on and so forth. A capitalist society where bourgeoisie prevails, and against aristocrats, they have their own domains and their own institutions. But civil society is, by and large, in a national society. It's not supranational. It is very much a part of the nation state, and it sort of rebuilds boundaries and values of the bourgeoisie. So what was national at the very beginning, civil society, is today is much more international, is much more global in nature. So that is to say, we have the European Court of Human Rights. Without that, or without GMO seeds imported from such and such country, you cannot really talk about civil society. Or when the explosion took place in the former USSR in Chernobyl, the radiation that it emitted did not just affect the USSR or the Ukraine, the entire Black Sea region. But if you and also if you're building a nuclear power plant by the boundaries of France, then French peasants might oppose to your scheme because radiation crosses boundaries. So as I said previously, it all boils down to the judiciary. And the civil society is not where good-hearted people fight for good things. It is those things, but also there are much more defensive mechanisms or reflexes. You have gongos, government-controlled organizations, and also you have organizations that are based on interests. So it's a very vast domain. And it has very intense relations with the state, with the political establishment, and those who wield power reproduce this domain continuously. So it is under a lot of influence, and it does wield a lot of influence over other domains. So all in all, here's what we can say. We are beset by even greater problems today. Neoliberal policies, reflections are in our day-to-day lives, but we cannot talk about a civil society that's guaranteed or rights that are all guaranteed. I mean, the US is a strong society. Even there, President Trump wreaked havoc in the society and in the institutions. So yes, institutions are much stronger there, and they were able to stave off some of the negative impact. But at least civil society is not something that gives us a social guarantee of sorts. It is very much still flimsy. And also one more thing that we could say is as follows: from the modern society to today, from the nation state to today. I mean, the modern society was full of hopes. The bourgeoisie were full of hopes. The working class were full of hopes. And on the horizon, there was an ideal world that was within reach. But today, we cannot talk about that. Modernity does not generate hopes, and civil society does not automatically generate hope in people. And everyone had dreams of economic development. Alan Turing, talked about this. But now, capitalism does not need its actors. The working class, they dedicate themselves to the factories or to their work, or not. No, I mean, it's all about the machinery, serial production. It's all about commissioning production to other countries, subcontracting to places like China, Africa. So the system is much more cruel. And the working class does not have this hope about the future. The system functions by itself. So what do these dispossessed people do? They stick to their cultural identities. Cultural actors are not a part of the system any longer. So you have cultures, identities, cultural capital, and also sentiments that are coming to the foreground, and they're becoming much more vulnerable as we speak. It's as if they are reshaped by images and slogans, and sentiments are running quite high, and we're living in the world of post-truth, as they say, populism as well, that gives way to racism. And civil society, amidst all of this, has this question to grapple with. So within civil society, you have these infiltrations as well. You have a lot of push and pull. And you have polarizations, you have cliques in today's world. That's the kind of world that we're living in. So I think the civil society should ask itself this question time and time again. And the question is this: what do others do? People that do not struggle like us, what do they do? How can we understand them? Their emotional capital. We need to talk about theory as well as the practice are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. No, that's fine. I was taking notes as you spoke, and there are a few things that I'd like to add. You talked about Kürşat Bumin in the 80s. Within the civil society, Nurdan Gülbilek published a seminal book, as you know, and um, and talked about how civil society came into existence. I just thought about that book. And of course, the 80s, and actually it all started in the 70s. There was a global economic crisis in the 80s. Thatcher and Reagan reached what they call the Washington Consensus, and the neoliberal period started all across the world. And today we are living in a different world, and we are seeing the reflections of neoliberal policies.
And now we have the climate crisis, food crisis. So the movement is becoming more international. And with the climate and food crisis, the themes have diversified. There are now multiple dimensions. But one thing you said was also very important. The complex structure of the civic space itself was also important. The relations in the civic space are also complex. So that was another important point. So let's continue with Yıldız Star in the LGBTI movement. How is Turkey doing? Let's listen to your story, your organization, and what is the importance of civil society for LGBTI people? What is the background in Turkey? And if you have any comments, how would you compare Turkey with the developed countries? Maybe in developed countries there are better examples, but what is the position of Turkey according to you? Thank you. Well, taking the floor after Ferhat Kentel is very good, because I also would like to talk about the concept of civil society itself. That's how I planned my speech indeed. The LGBTI plus movement in Turkey is not only a civil society movement. We can't really say this. Yes, it includes maybe all the organizational aspects and structures of civil society. We have been able to get organized maybe even before many other NGOs, but we also are using other tools and instruments to move forward, because we also have this diversity of the reality of the LGBTI plus groups. So we also are a whole of more eclectic movements when we say the LGBTI plus people. Most of the time when we say LGBTI plus, you always come up with a single image, but actually that single image is a result of discrimination, believing that being human is not subject to diversity. It considers you, this concept considers you as same and not as unique. It's sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. So after this introduction, I can say that after the 1980 coup d'etat in Turkey, the state apparatus increased its oppression on us, on LGBTI plus individuals. The torture, discriminative behavior has increased. Maybe before there was a reality that was censored, or maybe LGBTI people were seen as an object of humor, or sometimes we were even considered as freaks. You know, in the 1940s, 50s, there were some news in the newspapers. There was this word of homosexual in the media. So the media was looking after or looking for this word homosexual. What is it? But as it wasn't that visible, people were commenting based on certain objects or objectification concepts. So we were not very sure if those news were real or fiction, fact or fiction. So post-truth actually maybe started back in the 1960s. There was so much content generated about homosexuality. People were chasing after this. What is this homosexuality? And people often had the image that this homosexuality comes from the West. Swedish homosexuals come to Istanbul, for instance, to seduce young Turkish boys. That was one of the news, for instance, in the media, but we don't know who those young Turkish people who were seduced were, who were those homosexual Swedish people were. But we had some news coverage like this. But in the 1980s, we started to see a ban on taking stage for trans women. For instance, not even trans women, but men who were cross-dressed, they were also banned to go out on stage to perform after the coup d'etat. So it was like a cultural and artistic space that was mostly affected, or the LGBTI plus individuals that existed in the cultural and arts sphere. But it wasn't only a ban on performing on stage, but in a way, people were put in trains and they were taken out of the town, and they were subject to torture in police stations in those days. That was the history we have seen. But during that history, all the opposing elements, dissidents, all the leftists were also subject to same behavior. Because on one hand, we had the political aspect, and on the other hand, we had a more social aspect of it. And people were saying, yes, these things happened as well. But these things were all intertwined, indeed. For instance, the law on misdemeanors is still used against trans individuals. For a long time, it has been this way. And the anti-terrorism law was also updated in the 2000s, and its discussions were in parallel with the law on misdemeanors. And this is not a coincidence. This is a way of governing or administrating in Turkey. However, in the 1980s, we had some actions. For instance, in 1987, at Gezi Park, the trans individuals started a hunger strike, actually, with a very basic demand, saying that we are here, we want the violence to come to an end. That was one period. And then, at that time, we had the Green Leftist Party, Ibrahim Eren, started to get organized. And slowly, in the 1980s, LGBTI plus individuals started to get organized with this oppression. But main organization corresponds to 1993, 94, the real roots, so to speak, of the LGBTI plus movement in Turkey started in that year. In 1993, they wanted to have a pride march, which was prevented, and people who wanted to participate in the pride were seriously attacked. Some of them were detained. And then Lamba Istanbul was established at that time in Istanbul. And in Ankara, the LGBTI plus people who were coming together in people's houses, homes, in Turkish baths, in parks, they come up with an idea to issue a journal. And the first issue of Chaos GL was published in 1999. So it's almost 30 years of getting organized uninterruptedly. There was this movement of LGBTI plus people in Turkey. So during the 1990s, we have an oral history study, by the way. Maybe I can send you the text after this speech. We have published a book throughout the 1990s, we have interviewed activists, and they say that at that time, that was a period of identifying the problems first. Okay, first getting together, finding people like themselves, really seeing the reality of LGBTI plus people. By the way, LGBTI plus people are different from other movements because you're not restricted to a certain region or geographical area. And you can only get together in private spaces, not in public spaces. And you make great efforts to learn certain things. Back in the 80s, 90s, in Kadıköy district of Istanbul, there was a park called Mendirek where people found each other. They had conversations, and if they liked each other, they would have sex. So there was this park, Mendirek Park, and only queer individuals would know that park. So you needed to have some information, so you needed to know that that park was a specific park. You needed to go there to meet people. Like in Ankara, they had Güven Park. People who found each other in Güven Park, they came together. They published this journal. So initially, we were discussing, should we publish this journal or not? And then all of a sudden the journal was published, and it's been published since 30 years. So that's the story of how our journal was published. So during the 90s, it was a period of finding each other, trying to have access to others who are similar to you, and being active all the time, constantly making efforts, trying to be out in the public sphere, failing to be out in the public sphere, not knowing what to do. So that was an area where the organization burgeoned, actually. And if you read the journals, Chaos GL journals at that time, it was also talking about giving land to the landless peasants. And it was also talking about trade unionization. And they tried to get organized in the Human Rights Association in Ankara. They wanted to establish a subcommittee, but they were kicked out of the association, and they established their own association, Chaos GL. So they were also trying to figure out what's happening in the field of education. For instance, what is the situation in the curriculum? And the civil society concept, the civil society criticized them. They would say the civil society clowns will come to us and ask about our problems. So they would criticize. LGBTI people would criticize the civil society. There were different discussions, and then the media was also assessed as a separate issue. Law was assessed as a separate issue. Murders were addressed as a separate issue. HIV, social life. So there is a huge... there is actually a huge work that was started to be built on. And then we, Chaos GL, participated in the marches of 1st of May. That was a landmark. For the first time ever, an LGBTI group organization taking to the streets was on the 1st of May with their rainbow flags. They went out, and then next year they also participate in the 1st of May march in Istanbul. And after that, the Pride March was carried out. So in the 2000s, starting with 2001, all these separate discussions, diversified in different fields with organizations in different cities. It also created a civil society sphere. The number of organizations increased. Many associations were established. Some of them were sued and closed down. And Chaos GL journal was censored, put into a dark plastic cover. By the way, I'm running out of my time, I guess. But when we talk about the LGBTI plus movement, we're also talking about a movement that goes beyond the borders and boundaries of the civil society. And it's basically about finding someone like yourself, socializing, looking for your rights, identifying the issues, coming up with demands for those issues. Having advocacy work for those demands, and as life goes on, while doing all these things, trying to come up with alternative spaces and places and outlets to solve those problems. So it's a very diversified and intertwined set of issues that is trying to be achieved by the movement. And lastly, maybe I can talk about today what's happening. So just like what happened in the 80 coup d'etat, we were more or less visible. And starting with 2015, this is a new phase for the LGBTI plus movement in Turkey. The government has waged a war against the LGBTI plus people. And I can't find any other word than war, because first there was the attack to the Pride March, and then constant bans followed in. And in 2017 in Ankara, everything with LGBTI plus content was banned. Then we sued them, we won the case. But then this became an organized and systematic state policy and reflex. And this is also indicated in our media monitoring report. Now LGBTI plus news are related to political news. So every social movement goes through certain phases, and after that visibility phase is completed, now we are seeing that we are standing at a turning point in time, and there is now conflict. We will either be recognized, and this will lead us to equality, thanks to a dynamic organization, or the state apparatus that has waged war against reality will partially win the war, and we will go back to the period before the 1980s. Not even the 90s. The state is trying to push the LGBTI plus movement to the period before 1980s, when our names were not even heard. We were beaten up and nothing was done about it. I think that's what they are trying to do. Okay, thank you. So, as you said, taking the floor after Professor Ferhat was important because we have seen the development of the civil society, and you also talked about the conceptual reaction. And I think it's very important to say that one is not strong enough, so you need to stand together with others, right? That's the feeling in the civil society, and we are seeing this feeling in the LGBTI plus individuals. And as you said, since 2015, the civil sphere is now shrinking, not only for LGBTI plus people, but for everyone, with the trustees being appointed. So there is a shrinkage in the civic space. And we can also talk about it in the part Rethinking Civil Society. So now I will move to Emrah Gürsel to talk about minority rights. Of course, when we say Germany, we're talking about a multicultural society and a country that lived through 2 world wars, which received huge amount of immigration afterwards. So I'm not very knowledgeable about the details of life in Germany, but theoretically, the minority rights are maybe better rooted in Germany, but one should always doubt himself or herself. Is it really the case? So you can also compare Germany and Turkey when it comes to the minority rights. What are your experiences? Let's hear from you. Okay, thank you first of all for inviting me here today. When we say minority rights, when we talk about these concepts, we think about 4 different things. We have the historic minorities like the Roma people, but that is not my field of expertise, and it's not a field where we have a lot of political discussions, but ethnic, sexual, and other minorities. When we talk about these issues, I think we can talk about Germany as an immigration country. I think country of immigration, this definition is not valid in all fields. That's what I realized after I came here. So at political level, people say, yes, this is a immigration country. We are a multicultural society. People say this, but in the eyes of an average German citizen, they think even if a person has been living in Germany for 4 generations, if they have a Turkish background, they are still seen as foreigners, actually. So it's not only about cultural differences or religious differences, but sometimes it can lead all the way up to biological racism. Even if you speak perfect German, you have a very you have a perfect education. Even if you are born, you can still be stigmatized as a foreigner by German people. So that's what we see. And as Yıldız was explaining, there is this conflict now. And for LGBTI people, this can lead to a better situation or things can get worse. But I really believe that there is a reaction. Yes, there is a shift to multicultural society. And I don't remember the Turkish word, but in English, people say backlash. So there's also a backlash, like an allergy in the society, like the rise of Trump or President Trump or the rise of extreme right wings. So there are also some pain points brought by the transformation. So yes, we talk about the rule of law, other things, and I don't think it would be fair to criticize Germany having come from Turkey, but we still have some pain points, and we're working in this field, and my organization is working in this field, so I'm more knowledgeable about this. Anti-Semitism and racism are the topics that we focus on. To say a few words about these things, for instance, prejudices and bias against Muslims is very strong, very strong. 50% of the society have negative thoughts about Muslims. Sometimes this leads to physical attacks and hate crimes. Every single day we are seeing this. Every single day we see a hate crime being committed. It might be a minor thing like writing graffiti on a mosque wall or attacking a woman with the headscarf. So having an attack and assault every single day is very striking. Maybe you would remember in the last 2 years, we had major terror attacks last year in Hanau. And before that in Halle, one was against Jews and the other attack was against Muslims or group of people who were taught to be Muslims. So when new migrants come to Germany, they say, oh, I'm not a religious person. I don't think I will be facing any problems. But it doesn't really matter to what extent you're religious or even if you're a Muslim or not. It's about race, about your background, about your name. So when there is an indicator of your background, then you can face some experiences that we can call as racism against Muslims. There was a cafe that was attacked by an extreme right-wing person. Many people lost their lives. And one was a young person coming from the Balkans, a blonde guy with blue eyes, but his name was Hamza. So just because his name was Hamza, he was written in the police records as a Middle Eastern. And his father was just crying. He said, my son was blonde. He didn't look like a Middle Eastern person. So just because of your name being Hamza, the police also thinks you are a part of that group. So extreme or far-right organizations within the police or military, people talk about them a lot. And the addresses of some human rights advocates were shared with the police. That was revealed. And there was an incident most recently. A black activist had to move out because he was receiving threats on social media.
But not all is going bad. But of course, there's a rule of law here, and we as a society or as an institution, we can go to any school, provided the principal gives us the okay. It's not like we have to talk to the Ministry of National Education and so on and so forth, or gringos, gongos. So it's definitely the decision of the school. You can go to the school and say, we would like to cover the LGBT issue, or you can train the students if the principal gives you the okay. Or you can support the civil society. In the last 10 years, actually, in terms of democracy and human rights, millions of euros have been allocated to associations. And of course, this brings about certain challenges and certain paradoxes, because right now, I, as someone coming from Turkey, I can't tell whether it's a government authority or whether it's an organization in the field of memory. For instance, let's say there's a memorial, a concentration camp previously, but it's an association, but it's like a public authority because they receive a lot of funding from the state, and that's good. But when you look at the manager, there's someone who used to be an anti-fascist. So it's the state and the civil society all intertwined. You talked about, civil society as being not part of the state previously, but like I said, the civil society and the state have become intertwined, and the discussions are mainly through politics or different schools of thought, and even the terminology that we use has become different. Because it's a democratic society, it looks as if things are fine, but there are some minor glitches as well. Certain institutions attack, for instance, against globalization. It's a coalition. and their status was taken away due to their political convictions. So certain political organizations privileges are stripped off, or an organization receiving government funds, if they criticize the ultra-right party, then they're criticized. So in case of a right-wing government, for instance, on a local level, national level, I don't know how things will pan out. So democracy is vulnerable. We always say it's not a given. So the whole structure is quite fragile. So that's all from my side for the time being. But like I said, it's not black and white. It's more like a range. There are many different hues, many different tensions, and many different clashes within this range. Thank you very much for your contributions. This has been quite interesting to listen to the German experience. It is always useful to doubt. We have realized once again. You talked about the complex structure there. Let's move on to education. And one of the since 2003, Işık Tüzün's organization has been defending children's rights to education. Education Reform Initiative is their name, and we talked about what is outside the markets, family, or the state is the civil society, simply put. But when we talk about education, we definitely think about the public sphere. Education should be public. It should be free of charge. Monetary concerns should not intervene. And there have been monetary injustices all across the world since time memorial, social injustices. And we see that these are being deepened. And in terms of education, we see a gap that cannot be closed easily through social initiatives. Even through social initiatives, we cannot redress the balance. I'm a bit pessimistic when it comes to these issues. Perhaps your take will be much more optimistic. What are the priorities in the field of education? What would you say? Thank you very much. I think everyone can hear me. Yes. Yeah, I have been an avid participant up until this point, and now I will don my speaker's hat. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. The main responsible party here is the state. The state needs to offer qualified national education within the framework of human rights as well. Private actors, can they offer alternatives in certain areas? Yes, but everything should be on a par with human rights related standards, and the state is liable to ensure that that is the case. Presence of other actors does not take away from the responsibility of the state to provide top quality national education. Before we move on to civil society, in terms of responsibilities of the state, I might say a few words, if I may. I believe I still have some time. Now, when we talk about the responsibilities of the state, of course, we can get to the details. We can talk about detailed standards and so on and so forth. But above all else, we need to realize that when we talk about educational institutions, that they should offer qualified education and facilities that ensure hygiene related standards. All of this is not enough to offer everyone the same level of education. Accessibility is key, and there are different dimensions of accessibility. There should not be any discrimination whatsoever, and physical accessibility is key. Economic accessibility is key as well. So accessibility is multifunctional as well, but accessibility is not also enough. An acceptable level of education must be offered. When we say acceptable, it needs to be acceptable by kids. It should be. It should not have any components of violation. It should be anti-discriminatory in its methods and in terms of its curricula, and also it should be adaptable. It should be adaptable based on the ever-changing needs of the societies, different needs of and so on and so forth. So in Turkey, in all of these dimensions, we have improvement areas, but when we look at the previous years and the steps that were taken or the discussions we've had, were mainly geared towards availability and accessibility. But when it comes to the acceptability or adaptability of education, things are actually much more grave. The picture is much more bleak. When it comes to the role of the civil society, these responsibilities I wanted to focus on because we need to understand properly what the civil society can do and how. Of course, education is an area where the civil society's role is limited to um, reaching out to those that the state cannot reach out to or contemplating the state's efforts. But as far as I'm concerned, and my initiative's point of view is also that the civil society should trigger change, should be transformative in its role and in its activities when it comes to education, just like in other areas. Of course, we might focus on civil society in Turkey as well, but by and large, there are different roles that the civil society can undertake. Working with rights owners and creating environments so that they can have better access, or devising innovative models and making them commonplace, and working as in advocacy or also monitoring. Our initiative is quite active in this field as well. We do a lot of monitoring. We focus on a particular area and try and track change, and also this is a call for call to the state in terms of accountability, and I think this is a very important endeavor. In light of the findings of the monitoring projects, you need to also inform the public. It's not all about the deliverables; it's about the processes as well, making things much more accountable, much more transparent, much more participatory. That's why you need to inform the society. You need to encourage their participation. These are some of the critical roles that the civil society can undertake, and of course, affecting policy and advocacy are other important roles, I would think. When we look at Turkey, in the domain of education, we see many civil society organizations that are active in this area. But when it comes to the objectives of the education, of course, their perspectives are different, their priorities are different, and their take on the responsibility of the civil society might be different and diverse. And this diversity also has to do with resources and relations with beneficiaries or right owners. You have the whole gamut when it comes to civil society organizations in education in Turkey, but their approach is much more service oriented. Of course, there are some initiatives that are more policy based, more advocacy based, that are trying to sort of transform the system. But mainly, you have these in smaller numbers. But of course, not all of these organizations are clearly delineated. Some organizations are much more practice-based, but they try to transfer this experience to policymaking. So civil society is quite active in education in Turkey when it comes to equal opportunities through scholarships, supporting that, or building dorms, building schools, and trying to sort of support the educational system and rendering the services that the state cannot fully. In this area, the civil society has been very active for quite some time, and also creating safe areas for children outside schools, supporting their academic skills or emotional skills, social skills. Offering such programs are some of the things that civil society organizations do in Turkey. And there are some organizations that bring together teachers and aid their personal development, or offer solidarity, or exhibit solidarity to them. And also, you have additionally more policy-based research and advocacy groups. So there's a wide range of diversity. And also, here's one thing that we might say. not all NGOs working in education in Turkey carry out advocacy work or should carry out advocacy work. But thanks to this diversity, you have some organizations that are trying to transform the system and affect policy change. I think there's more need for such organizations. Of course, service-oriented endeavors are not to be overlooked. I do not shut them out, but because there are burning issues, burning needs in this country, and there are rights violations that take place on a daily basis. So these service-oriented organizations fulfill a very important need. But here, rights-based approach and its principles should be perhaps considered. With these needs, with these with this diversity, I might also talk about a few problem areas that are not special to education. Maybe this is going to be a bit of a repetition, but between civil society and the public regarding this relationship, there is no binding framework that encourages participation, and education is also affected negatively by this. Policy-making processes are not transparent, are not transitory, and that is a major downside for NGOs and for beneficiaries, children, and parents and teachers. There's a lack of participation or lack of participatory outlook when it comes to this. And many projects, or I'm trying to gather my thoughts, says the speaker. So the foundation for cooperation is rather weak in this decade, let's say. And when it comes to policy processes, for instance, which civil society organizations are invited at schools, what civil society organizations can actually carry out work, based on what criteria, are these selected, and so on and so forth. These are also important question marks, and there's a lack of transparency here as well. And yet another important issue, discrimination and lack of equality. But is there an approach that tries to uncover this? I doubt it. It's quite weak in Turkey. There's intersectional injustices, inequalities. When you look at the data collected, of course, data collection of data is difficult enough, and sharing of data to come up with the right policies is easier said than done. And there are some very important problem areas. You have lack of data about, for instance, schooling rates, for instance. You have schooling rates, but you don't have truancy rates. You don't have any rate for dropouts. So you need sortation of this data. So in the breakdown, you have gender, for instance, and region, but you don't have ethnicity, you don't have disability, you don't have immigration status. So there are all of these different dimensions that you need to see the big picture. And for that, you need more properly arranged data. And also another deficiency, lack of impact analyses in Turkey. And when it comes to policy change and in education, you have fundamental reforms all the time in terms of groups that are subjected to discrimination or vulnerable groups. A preliminary analysis must be drawn up before policy changes, and of course after policy changes. And that's what we're desperately needing in Turkey, and that's all I'd like to say. Well, the civil society is exactly like this. You have all these bifurcations, and you digress, and you go off topic, and you strike relations and cooperation with other fields, and that's only normal. But let's get back to the ground as well. Let's hear from what's going on the ground. The civil society, what other activities can it carry out? Services, advocacy, participation to management processes, and active citizenship awareness raising. These are the 4 areas where civil society is active. But on the other hand, when we look at the field, well, what's going on the ground, you talked about cooperation and give and take of ideas, exchange of views. All of this is important. And I believe Yıldız Tar is not with us right now, so let us continue with Emrah Gürsel. So the ball is in your court. And then we will continue with the next round. So for the civil society, we call it a universal realm. Minority rights are no different. It is something that pertains to humanity at large. So on the ground, what are the things that challenge you the most? And how can you address these issues? How should we fight against them? And these are the things that we question all the time. Prejudices, how to deal with them. And in this long-standing struggle, what are the things that need to be done? Of course, it's very difficult to answer this question. But in the Northern Hemisphere, discussions and problems are vastly different than what's going on in the global South. In China, you're talking about genocide or genocide-like practices against the Uyghur Muslims, and then somewhere else in Syria, you talked about also genocide against the Yazidi on the Iraq side by ISIS, and somewhere else you talk about cultural rights, political rights, this and that. So you cannot come up with an overarching prescription. But when you look at the West, because my organization is headquartered in the West, and that's what I know best. So one of the main issues here, I would say, is this, especially when it comes to a hate speech or hate against minorities. A participant once said, there's a fascist international right now. So fascism has become global. Maybe this is a bit over the top, but then again, maybe not. There was this research in a newspaper in Sweden, Russia, in the US, in Germany. You see all these fascist organizations that are learning from one another, giving them gun training and online training on several different topics. Or in Christchurch in New Zealand, you know what happened? The perpetrator actually broadcast the whole massacre on Facebook, and some people were inspired by this, and some people attacked a synagogue in Germany and also broadcast it online. Broadcast this terrorist attack. So these racist organizations, fascist organizations are learning from one another, and also individuals are influenced by one another. Video games, for instance, such as platforms such as Twitch, other social media outlets are prone to radicalization of young people. And you have this in Islamists as well as individuals. They are radicalized in places that you wouldn't expect. So there's this international problem that needs to be grappled with. The pandemic also revealed the extent of public health and immigration. Everything's international. Civil society, was it truly international when it first originated or not? That's what we discussed. But because the problems are international, coalitions must be international as well. Of course, on the local level, solutions could be different on the street, but we need to talk to one another. Otherwise, we cannot fight against this. Now, international coalitions really deserve the first priority here, I believe. And also this dichotomy between the civil society and the state and companies in certain areas. Also, we need to overcome this hurdle, like digital disinformation or digital hate. The European Union is currently focusing on this, and the Digital Service Act was being debated only recently.
So the states and international organizations intervening in this, for instance, you can even organize a genocide through Facebook, for instance. So we need to mobilize the relevant institutions, and the states, maybe they need in the same way an expertise in this field, and companies, high-tech companies, for instance, the states, NGOs need to be talking to one another. Of course, there are certain paradoxes. For instance, non-democratic governments, for instance, in order to prevent online violence, you need to take some measures, you need to intervene, right? But sometimes the governments misuse this because we don't trust the government, right? So on the other hand, we need some state intervention, government intervention. People can be massacred, or there can be elections that are rigged because of these technologies. So that's going to be another challenge waiting for us. And we need to fix this. I don't know what the answer is, but as a civil society, how can we work together with the governments, with companies to have a balanced relationship? To what extent we need to intervene or not? So in terms of our field, that's a major discussion, I believe. And maybe as one last item, I can say that all the activities that we carry out, all the models that we produce, such as service models, advocacy work, yes, we do have this corpus of activities, but on the other hand, we're also very weak. I'm working in Europe. In Germany, we have different funds, for instance, but in many European countries, the civil society is actually having a difficult time to pay for the salaries of the NGO employees, because this is no longer done through engagement, activism, but we have programs that are continuing for decades. So how are we going to sustain them? How are we going to generate funds and resources? We need to be thinking new things. We always talk about, fundraising, preparing projects. Yes, these are important things, but now the civil society organizations need to come up with certain things to generate their own resources. Sometimes this also creates some reactions, but otherwise we can't be effective in a different way. Yes, I was just thinking when you were talking, because of its structure, the civil society is seen as a sphere that needs to protect its amateur spirit. We need, of course, those funds, resources, projects. But on the other hand, it's the very characteristics of the civil society to be naive, to be outside the, market. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but yes, you interrupted me, but you said something very nice. For instance, Russia or Turkey has this attack, but we as naive people are just making press announcements against this. Or there's Facebook, for instance, with billions of dollars being earned. Just one single person has huge power, but then we civil society organizations as naive people come together, but it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't function anymore. So there are people who got professionalized and they're generating funds. No, we shouldn't be thinking like this. We need to think about our impact, systematic impact as civil society organizations, to see how we can transform the system. That's what we need to question. I don't know. Otherwise, we will just be satisfying ourselves. If we want to go beyond satisfying ourselves, we need to do something else. We need to think outside the box and get over our paradoxes. Otherwise, it will be like we are weak, we are naive. Yes, we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, the impact of high-tech companies. So we're talking about huge amounts of money, huge budgets. And against those huge budgets and financial resources, maybe we just have 2 employees. One is not even paid for. We just publish something that is not sustained. So this is not a balanced situation, Yes, you're very right. You're very right. Maybe we need to say this. Raising funds and financially becoming robust does not necessarily mean that you lose that spirit of being a civil society organization, a CSO. Okay, thank you. Let me turn back to Yıldız Tar. When you were concluding your speech, you said we are at a turning point. We will either go back to the period before the 1980s, or we will go through a period where we have equality with the rights granted. We're just in the middle, at a crossroads, you said, as a result of the developments after 2015 in Turkey. So let me ask you, what are you doing in the field? What can we do in the field? And I don't want to ask about Istanbul only, but what about the struggle and the movement in other cities of Anatolia, of Turkey? When we visit those cities in Turkey, of course, with this process of trustees being appointed to municipalities and this crackdown on civil society and LGBTI plus organizations were the first organizations that were targeted in the crackdown. So how is the situation in other cities? Of course, the center is Istanbul, but according to your experience in the field, what about the situation in other cities? Well, I am connecting to this platform from the heart of Anatolia, Ankara. So you said Istanbul is the center, but I don't know if there is a center at all. So let me just take it on from where Emrah Gürsel has left, the international dimension. Imagine that there is a country that is highly Muslim, that is highly Orthodox Catholic, and Orthodox people, if they go to a bar together, what would be the first thing that they would do? Attack LGBTI people. I'm talking about our geographical region, Russia, Poland, Turkey. So all these far-right populist regimes can learn very fast from one another, and we come together with the activists from the region, and we always say, okay, let's see which country, the LGBTI people in which country will have the worst situation this month, for instance. And we're trying to come up with similar methods, by the way. On one hand, all the countries, none of the countries see LGBTIs as a value and asset that belongs to them, because we have family values, religious values, national values, these set of values. I always think that this concept of values is a dangerous one, because every time you face this barrier when we have bans, for instance, other practices. These countries, for instance, 4 countries, they come together. Maybe they would think they wouldn't have any common values, right? They wouldn't have any similarities. But when it comes to LGBTI plus people, all of a sudden these 4 countries start owning their own values, and they learn from one another very fast. Last year, we organized an international meeting with participants from Mexico, Brazil. Activists from different countries came together, and we saw that this pattern learns very fast from one another. And by using the same mechanisms, they start using the same methods. And that was very interesting for me when I learned it at that international meeting. So against this, we need to also act as fast as them in a civil society sphere. We don't have actually a human rights sphere or a civic sphere. I'm not only talking about LGBTI plus rights, I'm talking about the rights in general, the advocacy of all the rights in general. Imagine all the activities to be organized by a certain group are banned in Turkey. All the activities of LGBTI plus people are banned. This is just like what happened before the apartheid, or what's happening in Russia. So at local level, national level, or international level, in the civil society, or in the states, or in the international human rights mechanisms, including the European Union, where different countries come together and make major commitments, the reactions are only limited to saying that they are concerned. Sometimes they are deeply concerned. Sometimes they are extremely concerned. All these mechanisms only express their concern. They don't do anything else, especially for the LGBTI plus people. One of our mottos in peace demonstrations was this: put an end or stop this undeclared war against LGBTI plus people. So that later in time, we had to delete that undeclared part from the motto, because now we had a declared war, actually. So think about the pandemic. Normally, the groups that would not normally work with one another, the groups that would have problems with one another, came together to wage a war against the LGBTI people. This is a very dangerous dynamic, actually, because of its implications and ramifications, and because of its own existence. In my career as a journalist, the first news I covered back in 2010 was about a lynching initiative against trans women. They were shut down in their houses, and the groups attacking those trans people, some of them were religious people that had just come out of a mosque. And then there was another group. There was a retired army official saying that we can't have trans people in this country established by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And then there was another group just following or just watching. And by the way, anyone can be lynched nowadays, even on social media. So there were the people from the community. They were sitting in a circle, and the police was waiting outside. And then somebody brought baklava, dessert, and they ate dessert, baklava. And imagine this atmosphere. That was the first news I covered. And now what I feel was that coalition of people actually reflects the coalition in Turkey. Now it has expanded to all Turkey and to all LGBTI people. Think about the pandemic. Since the beginning of the pandemic, from the Ministry of National Education to the Ministry of Commerce, from the Supreme Board of Television Broadcasting to the Presidency of the Republic, there is a chain of reactions and policies against LGBTI plus people. Unfortunately, this is not an effort to change the agenda, but this is the agenda itself. It has been building up step by step. And against this issue that has been building up, there is this alienation and this situation whereby we are becoming more and more vulnerable. I will give you 3 examples about your question. First of all, in Boğaziçi University, Bosphorus University protests, because it's the fundamental right of students to protest, right? And then there was also this artwork, and a big fuss was made out of that artwork that was exhibited during the protests. There was an argument saying that it's against the religious values, that artwork. And then before that, on the 23rd of April last year, we had this incident. In 2 years, we will be celebrating the 1-year anniversary. There was an argument against LGBTI people existing through children. So there is this international homosexuals lobby, as they say, against the family. So this is the same discourse we see in the Germany of the 1930s and 1940s, and in France and in USA. They were always looking for this international conspiracy, like these people are a species, they are in contact with one another, they are going to invade the entire world. There is this paranoia, this conspiracy, and the same conspiracy and paranoia is reactivated by certain different groups and states, and they are one actor is the Gongos, the government operated or organized NGOs. So the civil society organizations that are against LGBTI people were the most audible or vocal people. For instance, remember the discourse against Istanbul Convention and the stance of Kadem Association against these discourses. It's the same thing. So we need to remind people of the rights and freedoms again and again. That's what we need, and that's one commonality one common ground we can find. But how is it going to be possible? If you ask that question, we need to ask it. So before the Boğaziçi resistance, there was a case in Poland. There is a Virgin Mary picture, and the activists put a rainbow light on it, and I was covering that news, and the day I covered the news, I wrote to an activist in Polish. I said, your situation is worse than us. At least we're not having those things. And then at the same night, we had this issue related to the artwork in Boğaziçi, Bosphorus resistance. So you need to actually think about these things. The government and the government's social partners are engaged in this coalition against the LGBTI people, but you need to be setting the agenda. You need to be transferring your own agenda rather than them setting the agenda of the country. And this requires the development of a culture of working together, especially working together in the field of LGBTI plus people. So there is also something, by the way, withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention was done because the presidency of the Republic said it rationalizes homosexuality. So I don't think we're facing any problems in terms of seeing the picture. But what we are having problems with is that there is a power asymmetry, and there is also another asymmetrical issue, which is that since 2015, the government has been developing policies against LGBTI people. This is something that they're not doing against other civil society organizations. And sharing rainbows during Pride Week is the only thing that the NGOs are doing. So the government is not uneducated, actually. They're very well equipped. They have very good intelligence work. They have policies actually specifically targeting these groups. But on the other hand, in terms of rights, we don't have the same equipment. And I'll just give one example and then I'll wrap up. For instance, the Ministry of Commerce banned all the products that have a rainbow symbol on them, like mugs, towels. They banned selling those products without a warning sign that it's for people above the age of 18. So we have the Bar Association of Turkey, the Turkish Medical Association, included in the committee of the Ministry of Commerce. And the Ministry of Commerce insistently said that they took the decision unanimously. And then somebody launched an inquiry. We asked for the decision, explained decision, and it really says all those products, if they are sold without a warning that it contains LGBTI elements, are sold, it will impact children in a negative way. And I've been talking about this. The Medical Association of Turkey made this historic mistake. They also voted for it. They didn't make a declaration saying that we didn't sign this decision, but they just said, oh, we thought it was interpreted in a different way. But no, it was obvious that this would be interpreted in this way. So if that being the case, then the mistakes are now intolerable. Because we are really seeing a situation whereby LGBTI plus people are being left alone, isolated, and trying to be shown as marginalized people. And people are saying to the other CSOs that don't mess or don't get involved with these LGBTI plus people, otherwise you will have problems. So all the actors of the civil society, all the stakeholders are now moving away from us, and now a mug with a rainbow cannot be sold anymore. So it's linked to the Bosphorus resistance and being tortured in a police station because you have a rainbow flag, and then this rainbow symbol is seen as a crime organization, criminal organization. So this is a very basic thing. We need to come up with common strategies against common tactics at the international platform. And then when it comes to LGBTI plus people, we should no longer think that this is a sphere for LGBTI plus people only, but we need to also show solidarity with them and work in that field as well. Otherwise, isolation and becoming more vulnerable will take place for another 5 years. And last word, I would like to conclude with something that, as Beata said in that international meeting, she said, hope is like a muscle, you need to build it constantly. So hope is like a muscle, we need to work on it on a regular basis. And in 2014-15, as members of Chaos GL, we held activities in 40 different cities of Turkey, and they were all different initiatives of getting organized. And after the pandemic, on an online platform, we are able to get together with them. And sometimes we also have prejudices, thinking that it's very difficult to work outside Istanbul. No, in all cities now, LGBTI plus people can get organized, and social transformation is far ahead of the government policies, and they are afraid of this indeed. And maybe just two anecdotes I can tell you.
So at that time, I would go to 25 provinces. We went to Aksaray, a very small province, and people asked us because they wanted to take into account the Juma prayer. And I thought maybe they were fearful that we would be beaten after the Juma prayers, but they wanted people to participate and observe their Juma prayers. So we were able to address a very large audience. At another city, the university banned the event, our event. So a religious person, a religious organization offered us their premises, their house actually, and we held our event in that particular house. So this was only 5 years ago, so none of this is impossible. And all of these actually show us that the LGBT movement has been working tirelessly to instigate social change, and we created an amazing momentum. And what is being curbed right now is this social movement. And for 5 years, they have been campaigning to shut down LGBT organizations, and we have been under a lot of attack. So hopefully, the actors will assume more responsibility, and we can turn this asymmetry upside down. Hopefully, thank you so much. This was also quite important. And let us now move on to Güzin, shall we? In the field of education, you have been running projects with many stakeholders, teachers chiefly amongst them. So the things that you have focused on in your recent reports, if you could please inform us on this, especially at this time and at the time of the pandemic. Now, I was encouraged by the name, the title of this session, and I thought this would be good food for thought. This concept of stakeholder, for quite some time now, I have been at a loss as to find an alternative to this term. But I don't think it really reflects people well, because it's like an umbrella. Sometimes you have right holders that are not visible, sometimes holders of responsibility that are invisible. I'm not coming up with a better alternative, but let's contemplate how we could replace the term stakeholder, I believe. Of course, education is a very special area. Everyone is a party to this directly. You might be a part of the system, you might be a right holder as a child, but everyone is actually a stakeholder to this. So in the field of education, and when it comes to the objectives of education, we do not have a common understanding. And also, if we are going to reach a consensus, it should be all-encompassing. It should promote diversity, and that should be one of the focal areas of this movement. On the one side, you have, for instance, children whose voice we don't really see, neither on the school level nor on the system-wide level are children involved in the process. And of course, because of the pandemic, things are changing, people's roles are changing, the way people live in their homes is changing. And now the focus is on the parents rather than children. And perhaps this could be exploited as an opportunity to instigate meaningful change and sharing of responsibilities or forging of relationships. And of course, teachers, like you have said, they have always been critical for us. their participation is integral, and also they have the potential to instigate change within the classroom because they rub shoulders with the children, and also there are countless other stakeholders as well. So we can also say perhaps that between governments or intragovernmental organizations, they're also intertwined with the civil society, and they do shape certain dynamics within the society. So maybe intergovernmental organizations should be held to account more frequently. And for me as well, these are all very pertinent and interesting questions. Of course, throughout this process with the pandemic and also in Turkey, socioeconomic origins and other discriminatory grounds have always been very important. The income level, educational level of the child's parents determines which school they go to, how many years they're in school for, and the deliverables of education as well. When you look at schools from an academic point of view and social point of view, they're not inclusive. They're much more homogeneous in nature. So this was the state of affairs before the pandemic, and new injustices have been popping up, or more deepened injustices, digital gap, and also there's the gender dimension as well. We are now talking about digital gap and deepening injustices, invisible injustices, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, when we talk about accessibility, I mean, for us, it was never off the table anyway. But now problems have been compounded, and this is something that is relevant for many children. And you need to change the nature of the discussion as well. And there's something that I take to heart. Humanist Bureau have this campaign that is entitled "The School Protects the Child," which the school gives academic skills to the child. Of course, it was never perfect, but it was a part of the child protection system as well. The fact that schools have been shut down means that we need to think about child protection and how to close that gap, and so on and so forth. And of course, training for quite some time, it was reduced to schools or academic skills, but education was never in a bell. It has many other dimensions as well. And maybe in these areas, we need to forge even stronger ties for the upcoming period. Child protection is one of them. Let us not neglect the fact that burden of care falls on the shoulders of girls and women in the household. So there are all of these different dimensions. So we need to think outside the box, and we need to reconceptualize what a school is. But in conjunction with all of that, up until now, the general approach, and I'm saying this for many different groups of children. 20 years ago, this was for girls, and then it was the children with special needs. In the last couple of years, we have been talking about immigrant children. So in a way, many public authorities, their focus has been, for instance, enrolling children in school. But how do you make schools more participatory? Because unless we do that, if children are subjected to bullying, for instance, at school, if teachers are not supported through the necessary tools, if their attitudes are not transformed, then we go back to square number one. So the focus has got to change and should be all about transforming the school and the process, the system as well. And civil society has a role to play here, but we are going through difficult times indeed. And we need to discuss certain things within the civil society. We need to reconceptualize civil society. And I guess that's why we're here today. And this is the most fruitful discussion indeed. Thank you very much. The COVID pandemic is really important because it also brings about lack of food in many countries in the world, mainly in Africa, because children would have at least one meal at school. And in the absence of that, the line of hunger is easily crossed. And also many girls, 2.5 million girls are becoming child brides because they cannot go to school when they're not in school. this is the situation that they are presented with, and many international organizations are actually raising the red flag about this. So in the field of education, really truly, there's something that we can all do. We are at a watershed moment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Kentel, what would you like to say finally? I guess your mic is muted. Now, at this round, I have 4 or 5 points to convey to you. There's one thing that has to be reckoned with. We are going through quite original times, neoliberal times, and at this time, identities have become accentuated, and in a paradoxical way, as these identities emerge, you have more encompassing encompassing populist identities as an easy way out. And probably neoliberalism and populism feed one another really well. And populism has been a vehicle for neoliberalism. And people are locking themselves in their own boxes in a bid to protect themselves. And you have this reductive approach, and this is what populism corresponds to. And this is the first dimension, but there's another dimension. All the surveys carried out, and I have been a part of youth research for quite some time, and there's a telling picture that's in front of us. There's something quite interesting, quite striking, this zeitgeist. Certain people are incredibly pragmatic. On the other hand, you have people looking for a home, something to protect them, something to shield them. The family is very important, especially at this time. So yes, there are identities, but there's fear from identities. Paradoxically, people reclaim their identities. Everyone's involved in their own identities, but there's a lack of trust when it comes to other identities. We're living in a society of risks, and also trusting an autocratic leader, believing in salvation. I guess this is what populism is giving way to, because of this vast despondency that is felt by many people. And because of that despondency, there's this idea of a salvation, someone who can speak to you in your clique, certain words appeal to you. So identities versus neoliberal era. And also the features of civil society is another discussion. It's like an ecosystem, I would wager to say. As Işık Tüzün said, poverty, have-nots, education, class-related matters, and we all experience all of these things when there's a shutdown. If you're poor, if you're a Kurd living in the southeast of Turkey, your experience might be different from a woman or like a ready-to-wear laborer or an Armenian in Kurtuluş. Your experiences might be different or very much be alike. At the same time, we talk about different struggles, but all of these struggles are actually intertwined in ways that we cannot truly imagine. For instance, ERG is a source of pride for all of us in Turkey. They have this network of teachers, and actors are empowered. Empowering the actors is key. How do you do that? Not just by training them as such. You need to get them to talk between themselves. Yıldız Star also talked about something that is similar. You go to a city and you talk to people, you talk to the others. And despite the fact that you didn't expect it at all, you end up talking to some very pious people. So we shouldn't have these modernist prejudices in our heads, because we need to, we're not living in that age anymore. We need to get out of our boxes and our identities. We don't have the luxury to stick to one identity only. And thirdly, we talked about this previously. Should we run projects or do something else? Running projects is something that we have got to do, but raising funds or running projects in order to maintain our physical existence causes us so much time and causes us to expend so much energy. And it's as if our raison d'etre is solely based on the funds that we can raise. So maybe we need to question that. Maybe we don't have the time to deal with the real problems. Maybe some of them we overlook because of this fight for survival. So is it the teachers that we want to focus on? Yes, then we need to reach out to teachers. We can't do anything without talking to the pictures or talking to the poor or talking to different ethnic groups. We need to understand how they explain themselves. So activities in this realm would carry so much weight if we focus on existing problems and take it from there. I mean, when it comes to village research, for instance, I mean, you can go to a village and tell them about herbicides, but unless they see an example, then they will not buy into what you say. So you need to empower actors and show people that it is possible to dress certain wounds in the society. So in line with what I said, one more thing: identities and intersection. Are you a Kurd only or an LGBT person only? No, but you are many different things at the same time. But not everyone is highly intellectual. Even if they're only intellectual, they might focus on one single dimension of their identities only. Despite the fact that we are all made up of intersections, we cannot really convey important messages on all of these different dimensions. That would not be possible for an ordinary human being. So we need to stand next to other people coming from other groups, other identities. My empowering myself is based on my togetherness with others, for instance. And also this has been focused on by pollsters or surveyors such as Konda. Justice, for instance, is a recurring theme. Members of the LGBT community, women, ultra-right people, ultra-left people, everyone cares about justice by and large in this country. So how come these people cannot talk between themselves? We need to overcome racism and ultra-right movements and discrimination and look at the roots of these movements. This modern rational progression or progress under these pretexts, there was a lot of conceitedness and modern state and nationalism, and these are quite apparent in Turkey, in Russia. Maybe before the revolution, you had a lot of populism. And populists are alike. People who vote for Trump, they are all victims to this. The Tea Party, they correspond quite roughly to conservative lovers of the late poet Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, victims in their own homeland. This is the discourse used by conservatives in Turkey and the Tea Party movement in the States as well. White, anyone who is not white are shut down by others. Why do these people turn a blind eye to people like President Obama? Because they label him as a Muslim, and it's as if it might be a lack of appealing to other people's sensitivities. So in a way, we need to find ways to appeal to these people, because that's what we need to do, because these are passions that are running deep in traumatic societies. We live in a society that suffered a series of traumas. So we, just like we are intersections as human beings, then the civil society movement should be all about intersectionality as well. And from a theoretical point of view and practical point of view, we have got to be interdisciplinary, intercultural, and we need to intercultural. That's how we should organize, and that's how civil society organizations should organize and get rid of their conceitedness and their pride. They shouldn't be organizations that think that they know it all, and also non-governmental organizations should think about their purpose. Why can't they embrace more people? Why can't they raise their voice? Perhaps it's because of an intrinsic problem that's within their ranks. I mean, my experience, it's not like I have the best experience, but I have been following civil society organizations in Turkey, in France, in Germany, and I see that these are not good people who are fighting against evil. Because NGOs are seen as profitable organizations by certain people, and they try to influence politics through the civil society. So there's a lot of political interests on the ground as well. So there are bosses in civil society, and organizations might have the right discourse, but within the organization, civil society organization, you have a hierarchy and you have incredible discrimination against people who are seen as outside and who engage in bullying and so on and so forth.
So it's about the power relations within the CSOs, and then people professionally working in CSOs with their networks, they're constantly organizing events, and their real addressees are not there. They don't have the opportunity to find the right people to engage to. So I saw in the chat box that question. That's why I tried to answer it, although it was not addressed to me. But I also wanted to say something on the internal functioning of the CSOs. We said, yes, people working at CSOs are not perfect people. We are just random people who have been somehow engaged in civil society activities. So we are not independent of these power struggles, power relations, or this mobbing. So the most urgent need for the CSOs is that Me Too campaign. You know that Me Too campaign, right, for women. So maybe we should start a campaign like that. Yes, in my organization, things like that also happened. Maybe that Ensar Foundation in Turkey, for instance, that scandal, when it happened, we criticized it, but then same mobbing, same violence is also happening in many other CSOs. So they should also speak up and talk about these issues. So we need to be rethinking the civil society in a way that is like a catharsis, maybe. I think it would be good. So without further ado, I'll stop here. Okay, thank you. There was a question addressed to you as well. You somehow answered this, but the question was that to what extent the expectation of a savior, someone to come and save us, really hinders the activities of civil society organizations? Well, this actually shows how different the society is. We know the social polarization in Turkey. We have this 50-50 polarization. Half of the society is waiting for a savior to come and save all of us, and the other 50% is waiting for another thing. We have neoliberalism, globalization, people failing to express themselves as a class, trade unions, class movements, all of them being oppressed is now weakening people, and then this is also feeding populism. So this is a theory of salvation. One day we will be free, This is something that was also used during many revolutions. People would say, yes, today we are living in hell. I'm talking about the material world. We are oppressed today. We are tortured today. We are living like hell, but one day we will reach paradise on earth, heaven on earth. This is like a salvation, emancipation theory of finding paradise. That's the world we are living in, because actors are losing self-confidence. So that's very important, that resisting civil society that is still trying to do something, I should come up and say, no, you don't need to wait for a savior, just one man to come and rescue you. No, we have such movements that are self-empowering, thank God. So I believe that both situations exist. And just like Yıldız said, yes, it's important to be optimistic. Hope is important. Even it's a minor thing, you need to magnify it, magnify that small hope, saying that, yes, there are these guys trying to say nice things, good things. And thanks to these guys, we can do good things. I think that is a precondition of reaching a better situation. Yes, the principle of hope then. Okay, thank you, Professor. Emrah Gürsel and Yıldız Tar, there is a question to you. That question of ethics. Right advocacy, and for the advocates of rights, ethics, is it equal to fairness? Is it being discussed enough? Let me give the floor to Emrah Gürsel first, and I would like to ask Yıldız also to give us an answer. And we have limited time because it's 7:49 now. We will wrap up at 8. And there is also a question about Istanbul Convention for Yıldız. How is it going to be reflected on the civil society? And what's your take on independent queers? So I will ask you to answer this later, Yıldız, but let's start with Emrah first. Well, it's important. It's not important at all in which organization you work. Mobbing exists everywhere, even if it's an human rights agency or institution. A report yesterday showed that people of color working in the London office of Amnesty International were subject to systematic mobbing, actually. In terms of their promotions, they were hindered, their skills were questioned, competences were questioned, and they were living in a very toxic environment. Imagine that is the Amnesty International. It's a Western country, an organization working in the field of human rights. So these things happen in all walks of life, and people who are involved in the civil society are not, selected or chosen people with super characteristics. No, we are people, sons and daughters of this society. So intersectionality is also very important, as mentioned. If you're working in one field, it doesn't necessarily mean that you turn your back on other fields. We need to be constantly re-educating, retraining ourselves. If I'm working in the field of racism, I should also be knowledgeable in the field of women's issues. I need to be sensitive on other issues such as the environment, for instance. I need to establish dialogue with people working in other fields. It's not only about establishing coalitions, but it's also about making what you do more meaningful. If you compartmentalize all the work, we will also be generating new issues. So we need to build coalitions, question these things, etc. Thank you. Yıldız. I definitely agree. If you are a rights advocate, it doesn't mean that you are by default an ethical person. You also need to be a fair person at the end of the day. If you're working somewhere, even if it's a CSO, it's a workplace. And in workplaces, employees have their rights. And you need to promote those rights. We hear a lot in civil society. People actually live in precarious works when it comes to projects because you don't have a contract, a long-term contract. Once the project is over, you will be unemployed. We need to talk about these things as well. And there was also a question about the sectors. For instance, I am working actively in different positions in different sectors. As part of our institutionalization, as CAOS GL, we built mechanisms and came up with rights policy documents. We have built many different mechanisms. We're still in progress. Actually, this is work in progress. We are even working in the field of gender, although we're working in that field. So we all know that these problems can exist, and when they exist, we need to find mechanisms to remedy those problems, and we need to have an action plan to see how to take action. We need to have those independent ombudspersons in place, for instance, independent mechanisms. When we face a problem, what should be the complaint mechanism, and what are the mechanisms that would prevent the people exercising mobbing to get away with it, for instance? We have different models, but if you take the models from other places, it doesn't really work. Every organization should develop their own models. For the last 3 years, for instance, we have been working on this. I personally always focus on the journalism aspect of the issue, so I'm in a more safe place, let's say. But we are also trying to figure out our communication problems within the organization, our mutual understandings of ethics, and because we have this world that we dream of, and if you don't start by changing things with yourself, you lose your faith. And for instance, I am in the board of directors of many different associations. I hear from those associations that efforts are being taken, steps are being taken, and we need to do this. If we don't do these things, then you will be open to mobbing. You would be also defenseless against rights violations. We shouldn't claim that we are all perfect. Nobody is perfect, but every time I attended a training on transphobia, the first thing I say is that we are all prone to homophobia, including me. The important thing is how we will react once this is revealed. So, Istanbul Convention discussion, you asked. That declaration or the text of independent queers, I think it was an important one. I can't say I fully agree with the text itself, with the entire text, but it's important that this struggle is a rights struggle for all people, not only LGBTI plus people. And the second thing, as far as we could monitor since 2016, when it comes to Istanbul Convention, they were always focusing on LGBTI plus people. It's not that Istanbul Convention is not legitimizing homosexuality. We need to say that being LGBTI plus doesn't require any legitimacy. And the second thing is that in the discrimination article of Istanbul Convention, it says that when you are subject to violence, the state or the government has the responsibility not to discriminate against any group. So it's not about saying, no, this convention is not about LGBTI plus people, but we need to be able to say that this convention was at least partially saying something about gender-based discrimination, and they couldn't even stand that. And we are asking even more. A constitution article regarding discrimination. We actually had this movement. We have our movement that worked for this. For long years, anti-discrimination is not the only issue here, but I think it was a valuable call, and the government withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention is very dangerous, and it directly impacts the LGBTI plus space, and it shows that the danger is increasing, and it also indicates that the state of emergency is no longer an emergency state. It's now an ordinary state. We have the decrees, the presidential decrees that are issued in the middle of the night, and this is becoming normal practice. It's not an emergency anymore. Yes, thank you so much. Last 3 minutes. Işık, would you like to add something in the last 3 minutes? Well, this hope, the issue of hope, I was thinking about it. Well, I don't want to give you a rosy picture, but I also can say that, yes, the space is shrinking somehow, but we're also engaging with new groups that we weren't engaged with before. In terms of creativity and learning from one another, we also have now new opportunities within these challenges that we are facing. So we need to also ask ourselves, what strategies have we used when the normal ways of working was not possible? What are the lessons learned? For instance, I think everyone needs to take a mirror and look at themselves and question themselves. Maybe we can learn new things and strategies from that. Thank you. Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of this panel organized by Rethinking Foundation. This was the panel called Rethinking Civil Society, Identities, Values, and Social Benefit. We've talked about the civil society in Turkey starting from the 1980s. We also tried to see what's happening in other countries, and we shared all this information. We talked about what's happening in the field, and of course, we talked about different things, and all the activities of the civil society intersected at one point. Thank you so much for your participation. This has really been a very fruitful and beneficial panel. Good evening.